Welcome back to the NSP. I'm your host, Chris Ayot. On this episode, I'm joined by Melanie Nadeau. Hailing from Port Cartier in Northern Quebec, as a kid, Melanie loved the outdoors, was a good student, and an accomplished athlete. With all that talent, she was keen to find adventure outside of her small town, so she joined the Navy. After 5 years in uniform, she was on to the next challenge at the University of Waterloo, where she studied environmental engineering. After a short detour to Northern Ireland, she graduated and started her professional journey, which eventually landed her as the Chief Executive Officer of COVE, a company focused on the commercialization of marine technology. Before we get to our guest, a word from our partner for this episode and a member of the Veteran Volunteerism Initiative, the Veteran Farm Project. As a part of the NSP's continued effort to support veteran businesses and charities, listen to how serving and women veterans can help fight food insecurities.
Hi, I'm Jessica, the founder and director of the Veteran Farm Project. We are a market farm located on 26 acres in Sweets Corner, Nova Scotia, about 30 minutes from Halifax. We have been supporting serving and women veterans since 2018, and our mission is to provide a safe and enriching space where women can spend time together in nature, participate in workshops, and volunteer helping around the farm. An example of a great volunteer opportunity is helping us plant, harvest, or pack our farm fresh produce. Our produce is added to our WeCare packages that are given to veteran families identified as facing food insecurities. This is why we are so excited to be a part of the Veteran Volunteer Initiative through the True Patriot Love Foundation with support by Veterans Affairs Canada. We strongly believe volunteering with an organization where you feel safe and supported is an incredibly powerful tool to help your mind, body, and spirit. To find out more about the Veteran Farm Project Society, please head over to our website or follow us on social media. We look forward to seeing you down on the farm.
If you are a veteran, see how you can get involved with one of the 7 charities part of the Veteran Volunteerism Initiative, brought to you by the True Patriot Love Foundation. And now, my friends, here's my conversation with Melanie Nadeau. Melanie, welcome to the podcast. Great to meet you in person.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
And so remind me again, you came down to Ottawa to do a little bit of work. You don't get here very often, though, do you?
Well, I probably come every couple of months, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll be in Ottawa every couple of months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bit of a departure from Halifax, though.
The good news is that it's a lot warmer here right now, so it's a nice welcome.
Oh, that's last time we talked. Didn't you have a huge snowstorm when we did our pre-discussion that you were digging out of?
Highly likely. Highly likely.
I feel like that was that was our last discussion. Is you were it's just we just dug out of the last big snowstorm. So
yeah, we had a pretty intense February this year, so that was probably when we last spoke.
I think it was. Yeah, it's been almost non-existent here in winter, which is great for me because I'm getting weaker as I get older when it comes to cold weather and snow. So I'm quite happy to see it in the rearview mirror. Family. Always start off with family and maybe a little bit about where your mom's from, and then we can get into where your dad's from originally.
Sure, yeah. So my mom's from close to Edmundston in New Brunswick. That's where she was born, but she moved around quite a bit. So they lived in Montreal and different parts of New Brunswick, and eventually she ended up in Northern Quebec, where she met my father. And my father grew up in Utica, New York, and then eventually found his way to New Brunswick, and then found his way up in Northern Quebec as well.
So what brought your mom up to Northern Quebec then?
Well, at the time she was, her dad had gotten a job with, I believe it was the mining company or it's mostly natural resources up in Northern Quebec. So he had gotten a job and they had 9 kids.
Okay.
And the mom moved up all the kids for this job that he had up there. And then when they relocated him, I believe after it was to Montreal, my mom stayed back and she stayed in Port Cartier and started working for the mining company there.
Well, she must have liked Port Cartier and the outdoors, especially going back to Montreal.
Well, it was kind of different. I think it was just part of, they were a big family moving around a lot. So it was just time for her to leave the coop and start on her own. And at that time, there was really good jobs in Northern Quebec. So, it was an opportunity for her to start working and making her own money and being independent and having the rest of the family go back to Montreal. So that was really, I think, the crux of it, of why she stayed there. I'm not sure that she was in the outdoors, although she was a really good basketball player. She's only about 5'1" and nothing.
Fast.
But she's fast. Like, she was a good basketball player, good in sports, and small communities tend to have those types of activities because that's what keeps you busy.
Yeah.
So for her, that was really important too. So she was involved in sports, and then she was able to get, a pretty good job at a very young age.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I was a kid in Cold Lake, Alberta, from grade 1 to grade 4, and I can't remember a time I didn't play. I played every sport that was out there just because that's what you did.
Yeah.
Right. That's what kept you busy and kept you occupied. So. Yeah, I know. I
Keeps you out of trouble.
It does. Yeah, because there is trouble to be found even in really small towns, for sure.
Yeah.
So what brought your dad up to that part of the world? Because if he's from northern New York.
Yeah, well, you see, my dad, actually, he was a draft dodger. And so when he drafted, I guess, what do you say, when he drafted dodged the war. Is that how you would say draft
conscripted?
Dodger? Conscript, yeah. So his platoon went over to Vietnam, and then, however that all unfolded, he went up to Northern Quebec for work.
Okay.
So he was an Anglophone, didn't speak a word of French, and he started to work for a company up there, a resource-based company.
Okay.
And that's how he ended up there, and, no family, nothing. And it was all about trying to find a good job, and that's where he got sent.
So I guess he was learning his French on the fly.
Yeah, it's interesting because he's learned French on the fly. And if you listen to my dad talk, and up in Northern Quebec, it's a slang, like it's, different type of French. And that's the way he speaks, and that's the way that he writes, because that's the way that he learned. So he never learned French formally. So he still writes like that. And, I understand him, but I'm sure you might not.
Well, I can guarantee if you'd ever heard me speak French, it doesn't matter if it's him or anybody else. It would be a challenge for me. Okay. So how did your parents meet? Were they working in the same place, or was it just sort of because it's a small town and being social?
Yeah, I'm not really sure of where the beginnings started, but it was a pretty small town. So it's down about 6,000, 7,000 people. So I'm sure they probably met at the local beer hall or something like that, and Legion or wherever it was. And, it sort of started there. And I think, 3 months after they started dating, they got married.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what are your sort of early memories of Port Cartier?
Well, growing up north, it's, what are my early memories? So, of course, as you talk about the sports, I think that was more as I got older. But my early memories, so my family, my dad was quite a hunter, and that's pretty common up there. So we spent a lot of times at our camp in the woods. So every weekend we'd go up with the skidoos in the winter, or, four-wheelers in the summer, and go up to the camp. And it's not like a cottage, it's a camp. It's a hunting camp. Yeah. And that's where we hung out as a family. We'd spend Christmases there, and that was sort of the lifestyle we had. And then, and then the other part of it, we had a good, part of my mom's family, her brother married into, it used to be called Montagnais, but they're Innu now. And so that was a big part of our upbringing. We spent a lot of time with them, and, we'd go to the reserve a lot. And at Christmas, they had these also camps that were on a river called St. Margaret River.
Okay.
And it's all First Nations, and it was pretty neat, actually. It was, we'd spend Christmas there, and you're eating bannock and whatever kind of woods meats that they would make on the stove. And so that was pretty special. Looking back now, like, I didn't realize it when I was a kid, but looking back, like, that's a pretty neat experience to have lived that and be so close to them and how their way of life.
Yeah, that is unique.
Yeah.
I mean, I think especially in this day and age where there's a lot more attention and a lot more awareness about First Nations, but to have that experience in your youth, yeah, that's pretty cool.
I mean, my aunt, she's a tough lady, and she was a very strong person in the on the reserve and within her community. And she passed away, I think it was in the 90s, and she still would, like, she would have been later in life, and she still would go out and stay in a teepee for like several months. Like, she was very hardcore, and she'd go hunting, and I remember, like, her getting porcupines and you name it, and that was just, she loved it. Like, that was just, what she did, and she really enjoyed it. And my uncle was quite funny, and so he was white Caucasian, and he had this thing where he always wore a tie, and so we'd always make fun of him because my aunt would be in
like
his
always?
teepee. Yeah, and he'd had come out with his shirt and his tie. We're like, what are you doing? They were really an odd couple, but they worked.
I love I love that sort of aspect about your aunt, because there's just a toughness, and it probably it's not even viewed. She probably didn't even view it as toughness. It was just, this is what I do.
Yeah, well, I can say that, yeah, it's what she did, but she was also quite scary. So I would say it was tough. I was scared of her, so I would never say no to her. But her community, like, she was very good with her community, and she did a lot of things in that community, whether it was with youth or, they do halls and dinners and all kinds of stuff. Like, she did so many things, and she had a lot of respect from her community. So I think all around us, we were all very, watchful of my aunt, and always said yes.
So other than being at the camp, being outdoors, I mean, how else did you spend your time as a kid when you weren't in school?
Well, I was in sports. I did dance for almost, what was it, at least 13, 14 years.
Okay,
Yeah.
wow.
So I was a ballerina, and then I moved into modern dance. So that was a big thing. And then we were a traveling dance troupe throughout Quebec. So that was kind of a neat group of women that, kept me busy, and along with other sports. But that was something that I had stuck through most of my time while I was in Port Cartier. So that was pretty neat.
So who was running like a competitive dance studio in Port Cartier then?
That's a good question. We had this incredible art director. He is so creative, and I don't know how he landed in Port Cartier.
Yeah.
But I don't recall his story. But he was just so creative, and you have these special people that show up sometime and then just create community around them. And he started this studio, and it was really neat to be part of. But he was definitely the gel of it, and super, super creative. So it was very neat.
Yeah, I think those kinds of people who are so passionate about things just draw other people in, right? They form that, like you said, they form that community when they are that passionate about something. And
I think we weren't that bad. Like, I think we were actually good. Based that we got out of Northern Quebec and we went around and did shows, so I feel like we weren't that bad.
How were you as a student? Did you like school? What was your sort of interest in academics?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because, Port Cartier was quite French. The school that I went to was English, so I was fortunate enough to go to a small English school called Riverview School. So there was about 30 students from kindergarten to grade 9.
Okay.
So
yeah.
that was the size of the school, so it was quite interesting. And very separate from like community, because you'd kind of go to school and then in your neighborhood it was, different kids. But I had great teachers. Like, I just recall all my teachers, they were really like caring in that. So I was into school. I liked school, and I tried my best. And I think looking back, like the teachers made a big difference in that. Yeah.
Did you have a sense of what you wanted to do after high school? Did you have anything in academically or dance that sort of got your attention and had a bit of a desire to go down a certain path?
Yeah, I didn't really after I did English school up to grade 9, and then I transferred over to the main French high school, and I knew that I was good in the math and that side and sciences, and I did enjoy that, but I didn't really have a good sense of calling. It was not obvious to me, and I remember going to the career counselor, and how they tell you can do this and you can do that, and I was just like, really? Like, I think one was like police officer, and I was like, I don't think so, but
doesn't sound
right. It doesn't sound right. So I don't know how accurate they are with those kind of tests, or even if they still do those tests, but I don't think anything resonated. But I think for me, it was really about what I knew I wanted was to kind of see more of the world. And my career trajectory could have been very likely, because both my parents worked for the mining company and my mom worked for the company for like 37 years. So her view was always, go get a job with good company, and, you make good money and that sort of thing. But I knew that wasn't my calling. And that's when I decided I'd join the Navy, because I was like, well, if I do that, I make money, I get to see a bit of the world, I leave Northern Quebec. So that's what I ended up doing. I don't know if it was a calling, but it seemed right at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes just doing something,
Yeah.
right, is useful.
Yeah.
As opposed to sort of waiting for whatever you think perfect should look like. Doing something that is going to be good enough will just get the ball rolling.
Well, and I knew that I didn't want to stay back. And I think that was it
Right.
for me. Like, I knew that I didn't want to stay up north. So that was probably more the calling than anything else, rather than academically. When I was in high school, it was more that, I don't think I'm going to stay up here. Like, I need to go figure the rest of the world out. Yeah.
So did you go and do sort of full-time naval service, or were you doing part-time and going to school? What was that?
Yeah. So I did. I started doing some training in Sept-Îles, and then I went to do basic at Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu.
Okay.
So if you remember, I don't know if you went there, but like the mega and the big buildings. So we were one of the first.
Chilliwack. I did
Chilliwack.
mine,
Okay. So
basically.
after Chilliwack, then it was Saint-Jean. And they had the mega. Anybody who's been there remembers the mega, where you have to climb the 10 stories like multiple times a day. So I think we were one of the first groups going through training there in those first early years. So this would have been like I think it was 94, 95.
Yeah, you absolutely
Probably
would have been.
around then, yeah. And so I went there, and then I did do school, like I did college throughout, and I was in the Naval Reserves, and then was able to do long-term contracts. So then I did both coasts, and mostly out of the West Coast, and did training there.
Nice.
Yeah, in Esquimalt.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was beautiful. I really loved it out there, and I went back and forth to Halifax a few times, but more for training.
Okay.
And then I got an opportunity to do, which was really neat, to do the trip round. So sailed the ship from Halifax to Victoria, or to Esquimalt,
Oh, cool.
through the Panama Canal. So that was a pretty neat experience. Yeah. And then otherwise, I mostly sailed up and down the coast, mostly up and down the Pacific coast.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you got to sort of tick that box of getting a bit of adventure, getting out of Port Cartier, and then I know you ended up going to university for engineering. So how did you make that decision, or that transition about now it's time to kind of move on to something else?
Yeah, well, I had done some good traveling and all that, as you say, and then I think I was at a decision point. I was in my early 20s, and I thought, is this my career? And the answer was, it's not. So I decided to kind of think about, what could I do? How could I get a job after I graduate? I need to go back to school. And I did, definitely had a knack for like the sciences and the math and the physics. I was very strong at physics. So I applied to a couple of universities, one being the University of Waterloo in engineering, and I got accepted. And then I left Esquimalt and moved down to Southern Ontario and went to Waterloo for 5 years.
So you got accepted to engineering, unlike me, which anybody who was a classmate of mine in high school, university will not be surprised of that fact. But what type of engineering did you do, and how did you make that choice about what to do? Because that was one of the things I found challenging as I was at military college, and the first 2 years are general science and engineering, and then you have to make a choice. And I chose chemical engineering, but I found it actually to be a very difficult choice to make. And probably the wrong one, actually, in hindsight.
Yeah, well, the hindsight is,
Yeah.
So with Waterloo, at least at the time, you had to choose your discipline from like application time. Like you didn't get these
I think it's the same still.
Yeah, you don't get this 2 years of grace to try to figure yourself out. So I ended up choosing. So this would have been in 97, 98. I decided to choose environmental engineering. And it was pretty fresh back then. It was a very new discipline. And a lot of my rationale, I think, for it was I wanted to do something bigger than myself. And I thought, even at that time, I already knew that we weren't treating the environment, like our environment as humans, as we should. And so, I thought, well, this is a way that I can do something better through my profession to, help society. And that would have been my thought process at that time. And that was why I went into environmental engineering. I mean, it's so different, but that was actually the thinking. Hindsight is quite different, as you say, but that was my thinking when I went into that program.
I mean, it makes eminent sense now. I'm just curious as to how someone at that point had the sort of clarity to identify the environment. Were you around people who were talking about the environment at that point? Because I can think of myself in the late 90s. I mean, I was lucky to be dressed right and show up on time, let alone thinking about the future and doing something bigger than myself and tying that to the environment.
Yeah, I can tell you when I was in Esquimalt, it was not the topic of the day.
Yeah. Right.
I don't know what was my inspiration, to be honest with you. Like looking back, not really sure what was my inspiration on the time, but I knew that it was a place where I felt that I could have impact. And I was going to gain this skill, this engineering skill, and I felt that I could have impact with it. I didn't know what that would look like. I can tell you, I had no idea what that was going to look like. But I had to make a choice, and, that was how I converged on that. And I wanted to go to Waterloo, so it seemed to be the right thing to do at that time, at least. Yeah, and I mean now, what is that, 30 years later, it's like now we're talking about climate change. And those were not words that we used to talk about in the 90s, like the impacts of climate change. And, a lot of the work that I do today, the energy transition and all these things, like those were not conversations we were having in the 90s. But for some reason, I was drawn to that area.
It seems to be we'll see if this theme develops throughout the conversation, but the Navy was, I just knew I wanted to leave and have some experiences, so we'll do this. And then environmental engineering, I want to have an impact, so this seems about right, and we'll do this. Is that something that's sort of common? Is that your general approach, or is that just something how you sort of managed the uncertainty of youth?
Oh, that's a good question.
I don't ask many, so that's, we'll chalk that one up as a winner.
I don't know. I think we'd have to talk more to see if there's a common thread there or not.
Let's see if it emerges, because I think it's
definitely just how it happened. I think it was also a bit, when I left the North to experience something else, it was, to be truthful, like to go in the military, it's a good job. Like when you're that young, Like it's a way to make some money and do that. So that was definitely on my mind. And same too with, it was a bit of survival with engineering. I thought, well, when I graduate, I can probably going to be able to get a job. So it sounds like a good thing to do, and an investment that's worthwhile. So that was also circulating through my head. Like, how do I make a good value out of what I'm going to be spending my time on?
So how was the transition to Waterloo? Because I think even back then, I mean, it was quite well known for being a demanding engineering program, and continues to be so to this day. So how did you find that transition?
The first couple of years were tough. Were tough because for a couple of reasons. So I'd been working, I'd been traveling, I'd had a lot of responsibility. Right. And that's one thing that I would say the military does really well, is they train you so well so that when you're faced with situations, you're ready to respond. And so I'd been in very interesting situations and had a lot of accountability and that. And I'd been out of school for a little bit. Obviously, I'd been in the workforce. And then so when I went to University of Waterloo, I was older than a lot of other students were there. So I had that adjustment. I'd been working and pretty autonomous for some time, where a lot of people were first out of family homes, first time living in residence. And I'd kind of, did that a couple of years ago. So that was an odd transition, and trying to kind of find your place with who are the people you're going to be able to associate with. So that was an adjustment. And then the other part was school. Like, you're right, like it was hard. Like, engineering was tough there. And the way that they do it with the co-op system, which, looking back, was amazing, because I learned so much through my work experiences. But you're in school for 4 months, you're working for 4 months, then you come back, you start your school semester, and then you're already looking for your next job. So it's this cycle that goes on for 5 years. So you don't really have a lot of downtime to contemplate what you're going to do with your life, or when you're done, or whatever else. So it is a pretty hefty load. Yeah, so I'd agree with that. Yeah, I'd agree with that statement.
You almost look like you're getting tired right now, just kind of reliving the moments.
Yeah. I mean, it's a wonderful school. I learned so much there, but it's tough. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not giving degrees away from Waterloo. That's for sure. So.
No, but there's amazing profs there. Like, one of my profs worked for NASA, and then he took me on as one of his researchers. I did amazing work with him. Like, there's some really interesting people at the university. So, that's really neat in itself. Again, looking back, like, what a great experience and exposure that I had in university, because there were some really interesting professors there.
And you were telling me when we spoke earlier about an exchange you did. And I found that story really, really interesting.
Yeah. So because of the intensity of Waterloo, I was like, I've got to figure, I'm going to get through the next couple of years. So I thought, can I do an exchange? Can I go out and, somewhere else in the world and take courses there? So Waterloo had good relationships with a couple of places, in the world, and different universities. And one that they had was what I thought was Ireland. And so I said, well, geez, going to Ireland sounds like a good time. Like, that sounds better than what I'm doing at Waterloo. So I applied, and then that all got processed. And then I didn't have a lot of money at the time, so I flew over to London. I took the bus up through Scotland, and then took a ferry over to Ireland. And then turns out I wasn't going to Ireland. I was going to Northern Ireland, and I was studying in Belfast.
No Google back then, so
like, clearly not a lot of maps. So I was pretty naive in the whole thing, and so I arrived in Belfast, and it was interesting times, because it was the Troubles were happening still, and so I had I didn't look at Wikipedia. I didn't look at anything before. Nobody briefed me on that.
Yeah.
So I, showed up and I was like, okay, I'm in Belfast. Okay, that's okay. And then I looked around, and then I went to University of Ulster, which is in a Protestant area. And then when I got dropped off by the bus, I was in a very Catholic area, and I thought, well, I'll just get a cab. Well, that's easier said than done, at least at the time. Like, you couldn't really get you had to figure out which cab you were going to go to that would go in a Protestant area.
Right.
So I sat on the side of a curb for at least probably 2 hours trying to figure out, how am I going to get to University of Ulster? Not, we didn't have Google Maps, we didn't have iPhones or anything like that. So
the kindness of strangers is what you were relying on.
Totally, the kindness of stranger, looking at like this student with a big backpack, being like, where have you landed? Like, you don't know where you are. What are you doing here? Needless to say, I eventually found a cab that was willing to drive me to the university, and then, that's where I started. That was a really neat experience, though, because I was very naive, but I learned a lot while I was there.
So beyond just sort of being in, amongst this interesting conflict that had been going on for so many years, I mean, is there other sort of aspects of being educated in Europe, being educated in that part of the world that differed from the Canadian experience?
Definitely. So part of me wanting to go to Ireland was having something, I thought, we'll go to the pub every night. Like, the culture sounds wonderful. Very different from what I was
pub every night
experiencing
sounds good.
in Waterloo. So not that I did that, but Waterloo was quite intense. And there it was interesting. So I was in engineering there. And they would go to tea every afternoon. So the professor would stop and it would be tea break. So that was very welcome. I was like, what do I do now? So we'd all go, like there was 22 of us in the class. We all would have tea around 2:00 in the afternoon, which was like...
It's very civilized.
So very civilized, very different. To their method of learning was all very, I wrote papers... which was not something you typically did at Waterloo. Like it's you've got a lot of assignments and a lot of materials to get through, labs and you name it. And there I would be given a topic and I'd have to, come up with a paper in a month. And it's like, wow, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
So a lot more time to process and I think through. So it was a very less output focus, more like time to process, discuss. And that's sort of what I found quite different. So it was very welcome too, because it was just a very different style of teaching and learning that I adopted there. And one of the things that was probably fundamental for me, and this was again in, 2000-ish, they were talking a lot about sustainability and renewable energy, and I'd never heard that at Waterloo. Like, even though I was environmental engineering, like, it was not part of the lexicon. And that's where I started to get interested in. I remember, I wrote a paper about, I think it was solar power at the time, and they were starting to look at these type of technologies in Europe and what impacts they would have. And I was like, we're not having those conversations in Canada, or at least I've never been part of those conversations. So that was very pivotal for me because it changed, when I came back to Canada, what I wanted to do. And it was sort of starting to give me a bit more direction. You asked me, like, did you just kind of figure this out and go there? But that was starting to give me more direction because I was like, this sounds really interesting. This seems like, we're going to have to look at different forms of energy. So that's something that was transformational for me with my time there, along with, of course, learning about the conflicts that were happening in Northern Ireland.
So did you get exposed to that? So you were at was it a Protestant university?
It was, yeah.
Okay. So what was that like then, sort of sitting on one side of the conflict, or being sort of in, I guess sitting on one side of the conflict, even if it's just a passive observer?
Yeah, well, I mean, as a student there, was always very careful of being the tourist because you never knew which side you were talking to.
Right.
So I was always I learned that very quickly. But what I think was most surprising for me, aside from, of course, the historical conflicts and the divides, I mean, there was a wall in Belfast that divided the Protestants from the Catholics. So that's very visible, but was in people who were going to university. So you think students aren't that engaged and that sort of thing. That was very clear, and it was very heartfelt where they stood. And so I think that was really surprising for me. Like, I understood, people that had lived it for decades and that, but people that were in their early 20s and teenage years, kind of end of their teenage years, like really were very passionate about the conflicts that were happening. And so, I think that surprised me more. And of course it was conversational.
Yeah.
It was very conversational. So, people were very open to talking about it, but you could tell there was a lot of passion behind it. Yeah. Yeah.
Did it change your view at all when you got back home?
Well, I didn't realize there was these type of conflicts. I thought I was going to Ireland and going to be at the pub all the time.
Yeah.
I had no idea I was going to arrive, and there was these divides, and there was, army tanks in the streets. And so, yeah, I was a little bit smarter when I came back and had a different perspective. And in fact, I always, there was somebody I just met that was going to Belfast. And I said, you have to understand the history there. Like, it's so important for us to acknowledge that sometimes we think wars happen in places where, like, civil wars happen in places that have been stricken with loads of conflict or that. But, there are civil wars that are happening in places like Northern Ireland that a lot of people don't know about. At least I didn't at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's certainly, anytime I've been in a spot where there's conflict, it does give me an appreciation for a couple of things. One, how fortunate we are here to not be subjected to that sort of risk and security threats. But like you said, also to dig into the history a little bit and understand, how this ended up being the way it is, which is really important.
Absolutely. Like, understanding both sides of the story, right?
Yeah.
And just getting to understand different perspectives and the histories that people have lived through, and, the day-to-day, what does that look like? So I came back quite changed from that, I would say. Yeah. Yeah.
So did you get a chance before you left Waterloo to lean into the sort of the renewables piece, sustainability piece, or did that come later? Was there any space to do that?
Well, I can't say there was space, but I made space.
Okay, good.
So when I came back, I was pretty energized by this idea of renewable energy. And so I went to talk to a couple of profs, and I was like, I think there's something here. Like, it feels like we should be talking about that. And they kind of went along with me. And so I designed my last year of engineering, taking courses that were not sort of the standard kind of linear path. They enabled me to take different courses from different departments to get a better perspective. So I think I took some from environmental resources and other areas, and economics and that. And then the last year design project, it was all about designing a grid that would integrate different types of renewable energy resources. So wind, solar, I think we had hydrogen. So this is, over 20
years ago.
5 years ago.
Yeah.
So our project was to design a grid and have different sources of energy come into it and see how it would operate and based on demand. So, I mean, it's kind of the realities that we're kind of facing today that are actually happening, and they're, so it's kind of neat to see that, like, that long ago, that's the type of work that I was working on.
And when you graduated from Waterloo, what did you do next? Did you get a chance to find that outlet on sustainability and renewables, or did you go a different sort of path?
It wasn't that direct.
Yeah.
So I did some environmental consulting, and then eventually I made a couple of phone calls. Like, I kind of did there used to be this, it was kind of like a phone book of companies. And I had targeted every company that sounded like renewable energy, and I did some cold calling and tried to figure it out. I didn't get very far. And then one day I met somebody, and he was head of, essentially he was negotiating for the government of Canada. It was called the CAFE standards. So vehicle fuel consumption standards, which California had done. So they're pretty significant fuel standards with auto manufacturers. And he decided to give me a job, and that was pretty neat. So I worked a lot with auto manufacturers, and my job was really to foresee technologies that could enable the reduction of fuel consumption. So at that time, I was looking at what are vehicle manufacturers, major auto manufacturers, doing in terms of electric vehicles. If you imagine, we were talking about electric vehicles back then, and now they're actually coming on the road. But there wasn't many of that. It was usually in the auto show that you would see, like the big conferences. You'd see when they the concept cars, exactly. So that was a big part of my job. So I'd have to look ahead and look at technologies and see how it could potentially impact fuel consumption standards. So it was a pretty neat role, and I was, sitting at the table with these auto manufacturers, and my boss, who was negotiating this for the government. So, and he was a guru in North America on fuel standards, and a really neat guy, and so that was probably my first memorable job that I had in my working career.
Did you have any mentors along the way? And I ask from a number of perspectives. Whether it's because you're in an emerging sort of area with sustainability and renewables. It's one of the things I'm always interested in is if people ever felt the need to have a mentor, if they sought it out, if it just sort of appeared naturally. I'm just curious about how, or if there was ever any sort of mentors or people who were influences in your sort of professional life.
Well, I'm a person who always has mentors, and I seek them out. I do a lot now. I've got a lot of different mentors, or different mentors for different things. But back then, like one of the mentors I remember, because after engineering, I thought, I did this job. I didn't really practice the engineering profession. Like people think, engineers are doing designs and that. I didn't really practice that, but I had one of my mentors. And usually I find my mentors come out because I have a connection. There's a moment in time where I'm looking for something. I don't know what it is yet, but I've got a connection with somebody, and I'm going to listen to what they have to say. So I had this boss who was an interesting guy when I worked in Toronto, and he was giving me some advice on what I should do in my life. And so this was earlier on in my career, and I said, well, I got this engineering degree. Like, what am I going to do with it? And he said, don't worry about that. He was like, the reason you got the engineering degree is because it taught you how to think and how to problem solve. That's how you're going to use your degree. And so it was completely a shift from what I thought. Like, I was like, oh, that's a very different perspective. And I always think about that now, because it's not like I'm a practicing engineer per se, but it's all about perspective. And so that mentor at the time of my life was quite influential in how I sort of sought the next roles that I was, seeking. It was not about, doing the analysis. It was about, oh, well, how am I going to get through that? Like, am I going to be challenged enough where I can use that muscle that I was taught to use? And so I think that's definitely carried over in my career for sure. And going back to the mentors, like I'm a strong believer in mentors. I've had mentors in most of my roles that I've had. I mean, now as a CEO, I seek mentors because the days can be hard. They say a CEO's role is a very lonely role, and that's true. And so you need people to call. And so I'm always, ready to call who I need because you need to surround yourself with people who either know more than you or are different than you or can help you if you're struggling through something, because you're kind of dealing with a lot of decision making that has to be done sometimes very, very quickly and has consequences. And that's tough. Yeah.
Do you have, I mean, I've signed up for the mentor model of a reason, a season, or a lifetime, right? So either it's the mentor, you need somebody for a specific issue, you need it for a specific time in your life, or it just becomes someone who is a lifetime mentor. I mean, do you have people that are in those buckets, or do you think of it in a different way?
Well, that resonates. I mean, that thinking definitely resonates, because there's always a time in your life where, and as you evolve, you start thinking differently. And also there's life that happens in the middle of that. So people's lives go in different directions. So, there's probably mentors that I'd love to call from, 20 years ago, but I don't know if they'd accept my phone call, So it's good to keep them fresh if you really had a connection with them. But I would say the one thing that I know for sure, the people that I've had that have really been influential in terms of mentorship, if I felt like I needed their advice or their guidance, I'd have no qualms with giving them a call or sending them a note and say, I'd really like to have a coffee with you. I'm going through something, and I think you'd really help me out. And I know that they would respond very quickly to that. And so that's the kind of people that I do like to, I know that I can lean into if I needed to. And those are the, what did you call it? Like those lifelong mentors, right? That you just know that if you needed them, they would say, sure, of course, and I mean, I'm a mentor to a lot of people as well. So it goes both ways, right? So you've got to be willing to put the time in as well, and you've got to get something out of that relationship.
Do you find that your approach is unique? Do you find that other people seek out mentors in your industry, or is it less common?
Well, is it less common? I know, like with the organization I'm with now, like we make it just part of the...
It's baked into the cake.
It's baked into the cake, yeah. It's just part, like we hire interns, you get a mentor from industry. Those things are really important. I did engineering. It's not very female, or it wasn't very female. There's not a lot of females or women around. I've always been in industries where there's not a lot of women around. So you've got to go out and find those mentors, because any area where there's not a lot of representation, you might have a tough go at it. So you need to make sure you've got a support network around you. So I tend to definitely seek out those that are maybe going through a tough time, because you've been there, done that, and you don't want them to kind of go through that hardship in the same way.
Absolutely.
So I'm always would pick up the phone if somebody says, okay, I'm really struggling through this, and and maybe I'm a little bit biased towards helping women, but you need that support. So I think that's been something I always will help somebody if ever they ask me to. And I do mentor quite a few people in that way.
I mean, I think it's great. It was one of the aspects of my career I enjoyed the most was mentoring, and I continue to do so to this day. I've said this before, I think on the podcast. I mean, I have been disappointed that although the military has a bit of a sense, or maybe people believe this sort of leadership mentorship is, again, it's one of these things that is everyone's doing. It's not, because it takes personal investment. If you're going to be a mentor, you have to invest time in other people. And same thing, if you're going to be mentored, I mean, you have work to do. So I think that it's one of the things that a lot of people maybe assume that happens in the military, the sort of leadership mentorship thing. But it's not my experience, because it does take a lot of effort to do both sides of that relationship.
One thing that I found too is like hindsight. We talk about hindsight. Like when I look back to some of my experiences, I had bosses and they were my boss.
Right.
And then some, they had leadership qualities that I really liked. So I was like, okay, well, I want to emulate that in my style of leadership down the road, and there were certain things I could leave behind, but when they became mentors was when I realized it in hindsight. And they continued to be some mentors. So I had some bosses, for example, that I look back on, and I only when I'm no longer working there, and I'm like, wow, they're a mentor. Like, they've had such an impact on me and my leadership style, and they're the ones that I would reach out and say, any chance you can go for a coffee? But I didn't think they were my mentors. I wouldn't have called them my mentors at all. I would have called them my boss. Mm-hmm. So it's happened after the fact. So I think that's been pretty neat. And so I think a lot about that when I meet you, talk about leadership. Like, you don't know that you're getting mentored in some cases because it's leadership. Mm-hmm. It's a style of leadership that you're responding to. Somebody else might not respond the same way, but you're responding to it, and eventually it can become like a mentorship, even if they're no longer your leader, or a different phase of your life, or whatever it is, just because you saw qualities in that person that just resonate with you, right?
Yeah.
And so I've noticed, I do have mentors that are, it's not like I sought them, but I just realized, wow, for 10 years of my life, they actually were my mentors. They became my mentors, and I didn't think of it that way.
Yeah, it's just, I think the way you split it up is like a boss. I mean, people fill these positions of authority, but it doesn't mean they're leaders, and it certainly doesn't mean they're mentors either. So I think that's important, because there's so many titles that are thrown around today that sort of have these connotations of leadership and the things that we hope somebody in charge would do. Whether they treat us, make us feel, develop us, whatever it is. But I think there's a real absence of that. And sometimes it's only through that reflection back going, wow, like, I really benefited from that person investing in me, putting effort in, because that's what it is. Again, it's an investment. You'll know it when it's happening, or you'll know it after the fact. But I think it's something that is in short supply these days. At least that's been my experience.
And I think, when I look back at those type of people, like, I think they were also very reflective of their leadership. And so it needs somebody, too, that's reflective of themselves. So that's something that, it's hard in the day-to-day shuffle. Like, days are really busy, but you've got to do is sort of look back and say, like, oh, how was my leadership there? Not great. It's not, it's not always good, but you got to learn from it. And so being reflective on leadership, I think, is important. So that's something that I've recognized in those people, why they eventually became my mentors. It was like, they were doing that all along. And that's something that, now I try to do. I definitely try to emulate, or at least pause and say, could I have done that a little bit different? Could I have said something a little bit different? And that's not, the boss. It's the leadership kind of coming out. Like, could I have been a better leader? Yeah, probably, if I had tackled it a little bit differently.
So how do you handle that when you reflect and you're not happy with maybe how you handled something as a leader? What is your normal sort of approach then to dealing with that in retrospect?
Well, acknowledging it is always the first step, no matter what. So it's recognizing that, you read the room and you're like, oh, okay, that might have not, in the moment, you don't really say, okay, just reading the room after that might have not been the right approach. And then think about, okay, what would you have done different? Sometimes you wouldn't have done anything different, really, at the end of the day. It was just, everybody's human. And that's the other thing, like, everybody's human, and sometimes you react in a way that's just human. But it's coming back, and, whether it's, I'd like to take things in a different route and talking to people and saying, maybe we should kind of refigure this out. Like, what do you think? Like, having a bit of a conversation about it, or calling a mentor and saying, I'm really struggling. Like, I'm not getting a lot of traction.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is, like, any ideas of what's going on. Sometimes it's not even leadership. Maybe it's, you're tactfully, you're not doing the right thing, or maybe that is part of leadership. So I don't think it's a slam dunk on any which way, but it kind of depends on the situation where you realize, like, that might not have gone as well as I would have hoped. What could I have done differently? And that, I don't think it happens in 24 hours. You gotta takes time to kind of realize that. And then the next time it happens, then you're like, I remember that didn't go well. I'm going to try to change my approach on this one. And so you try something different.
Right.
And maybe that resonates or it doesn't, right? Like it's a bit of trial and error, I'd say.
If you look back on sort of before COVE, I mean, what are some of the leadership experiences, some of the professional experiences you've had that really stand out to you?
Yeah, well, around mentorship, or are you
No,
thinking?
I think just your career path in general. I know that we've spoken about was it the International Electrotechnical Commission? You were chair there.
That's right. Yeah. So that was a really interesting opportunity. I was in my late 20s, and there was. So that's similar to ISO. It's if people usually tend to hear ISO. So there's an equivalent body out of Geneva that's called IEC, and they were doing some standardization work on wind energy, and we're going to look at offshore wind, and they were going to do some work on marine energy, and there was some coalescing happening internationally, and then my name got put in the pack to be the front runner to chair an international committee on this. So I was the youngest chair out of 100 years and the second female. And these had been going on for like 100 years. So a lot of pressure. But I didn't really look at it that way. I looked at it like, I've just got to do a really good job and I'm going to nail it. And so I was involved with chairing this committee, which is very business intensive because it's all these manufacturers around the world who, standards can have a big impact on the product that they develop.
Right, of course.
So can be pretty significant consequences. So there's a lot of vying of positions and that. So it was a very interesting experience. And I was there was, for the first couple of years, there weren't any other females. So I've had some interesting kind of trailblazing there to deal with in this space. One of them was probably most heartwarming for me, and done some work in South Korea with major shipbuilders. And Korea's got strong expertise in shipbuilding and manufacturing. And it's also very male dominated, like the industry is extremely male dominated there. And I had been chairing this for a couple of years, and probably one of the nicest compliments I had ever gotten was this gentleman from South Korea, this businessman, had brought this woman that he was grooming to work in the sector, and she had a PhD, and clearly she had her own merit, but that had never happened where they'd brought a woman to one of these meetings. And he told me, he said, I'm trying to share with her or allow her to see what the opportunity could be, that she could see me. And she didn't speak a word of English, so we never had a conversation, her and I. But I thought, wow, that's probably the best compliment I've ever gotten, where somebody brought somebody that he's trying to expose. She was obviously very competent, but trying to expose her to see if, she could, or people would believe that she could work in this industry. And so that was really, really neat. And of course, it was in very much broken English, but I got the gist of what he was trying to do and trying to mentor her.
Right.
At the end of the day, it goes back to mentorship. He was trying to mentor her and see if she could work in the industry and stay in the industry. And so that was pretty neat compliment that happened. I would say there's a lot of other non-compliments that happened along the way to improving yourself, but I thought that was pretty special. And I thought, wow, that's, if that's something that I can help enable, like that's great. So the work is worth it.
How did you find leading in an international environment?
Well, I first started off, I said, well, I need to understand how to build consensus. So it was all consensus building. Like a lot of that work is really consensus building and understanding people's different cultures and how they do business, and, how to read body language when you're sitting in a big room. And that's, if you can get good at it, like people who work in these forums, there's some you can pick up on those things. Like you end up picking up on, when the Americans are unhappy and you see what's happening and so, and the Japanese have a different style on how they like to do business. And so one of the, I remember when I went to Geneva and I sort of got a crash course on different cultures and how they do business in a sense. And that was really helpful because the approach is very different. So you have to be very adaptable to the cultural approaches. And that was so important because, if you can't manage that very well, like you'll never achieve consensus. So that was a big part. So it was about human behavior and just learning about less about the product, more about how am I going to get them to understand? How many meetings will it take for them to understand what we're really trying to where we're really trying to go and that. So it was more humanizing than you would think, and just learning about people and how do people think? How would they operate? Where are their tipping points, or what's going to make them tick that they're just not going to be happy with the approach. And so it was a lot of that, a lot of understanding people, probably more than anybody would think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now so, I don't know, maybe 10 years out of university, I mean, you've got an engineering degree. Did you have a different vision about where you wanted to go now? Because you came out of Ulster and you took a few different courses that started to tilt in one way. Has that evolved in your vision about where you wanted to go? Or were you, again, sort of looking for different opportunities to try and experience?
Well, I've still had a thread. I mean, sustainability is a big word and it's gotten bigger and bigger, but there's always been a thread of being involved in sustainability. So whether it was looking at alternative fuels and vehicles, or, I mean, one of the projects I had, which was pretty neat, if you remember the Mad Cow years.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one project I had was to see if we could render mad cows and use it for fuel, and would that have impact on humans? So, I've seen some very interesting things.
Like actually taking the animals that are being culled because of the disease.
That's right.
And using it as a biofuel.
That's right.
Oh, okay.
And putting that in our tanks, and what impact would that have on humans? Like, is there a potential for transmission and that? So it was pretty interesting work that I got exposed to, even though it was kind of in sustainability. But I've had some interesting projects like that. But I've always sort of had that trend of, I've been involved in the energy business before COVE for 10 years or so. So the whole energy sector is going through a huge transition towards clean power and behind the meter, what we call it, people using hybrid electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, using their own batteries. It's a huge transition happened there. So I've always had kind of that trend, and even with COVE, our big vision is focused on sustainability of the oceans, and how do we achieve that over time.
Now, I want to get to COVE here in a second, but you've mentioned a couple of times in terms of the pace of a CEO or the pace of a leader, and I'm wondering how you manage that in terms of routine, right? So whether it's morning routine, I don't really like the word balance, because I think it's really, balance for me is a bit of an illusion. It's just about choices, right? So sometimes you're going to need to surge and it's going to be a lot more work than it's going to be family or other things. And then other times there might be space to be able to privilege family in more ways. So for me, it's less about balance and more about choices, which is what I think exactly routine is. It's deliberate choices. So do you have a routine, or how do you sort of manage pace to have that sort of long-term ability to perform?
Well, I'm of the same view. I've been asked, how do you balance things? How do you balance work? How do you balance family life? How do you? I was like, there's never balance. There's always one thing that's off kilter.
Right.
So it doesn't matter. Sometimes you're like nailing it at work, but then you've got your relationship you need to work on, or it'll be, that's going great, and all of a sudden you forgot about your other part of your family. So it's never like balanced. I'm with you. I don't like that question at all. It was interesting. So for me, part of like my I've got to burn energy, so I do it at work. My team would probably think I can burn a lot of energy at work. It's nice when I'm out of the office, but I do, like, I wake up early in the morning. That's my routine. I work out. It just starts my day. It clears my head. It starts my day. Then of course I've got to, get the kids ready and do all that. Then it's true. It's routine though. I get into the office. My first thing is having a cup of coffee, and I just take a moment to myself. Sometimes I close my door. I'm usually an open door kind of person, but I close my door and I just need that, set the pace. And whether it's I look at my emails, I kind of go through, so I just have a sense that I'm on top of things. I'm not missing anything. And then the day usually starts to unravel. In whether it's meetings or your schedule, it's usually a pretty busy schedule, or different things that happen throughout the day that you didn't expect. I've worked a lot around time scheduling. Like, I've listened to a lot of podcasts myself on how people really try to structure their time. So internal meetings versus external meetings. So I have this thing where on Mondays I do all internal meetings. Sometimes it happens that I get in external meetings, but it's all internal. So I just know, okay, today I'm working with my team, and I like to start the week like that. Like, we're all sort of on the same page, and it gives me a bit of comfort. And then also if something happens on a Monday and you never know what the storm may be, well, I also know it's my team. They understand if things got to be shifted. So I'm not, so conflicted. So that's been something I've done with, scheduling, for example. There's those little things that, you do. You say it's a choice. Well, it's a little bit of trial and error again, but how do you get into managing the little things that can build up at times? I try to carve out time. I have this, we did this training at work on how to be more efficient and productive. And it's team training, and one of the things they were working with us was on calendars and how to use your calendars and all these things. So become very digital. Like, I hate carrying paper nowadays. Like, all my notes, my task lists it's all digitized, and that's been sort of a transition, and I really like that. So I just, if I'm worrying about something in my head, I just go and I write it down. I said, don't worry about that anymore. You'll deal with it. Like, a bit of that. But this task management thing was, they color coded, and it sounds kind of trivial, color coding your calendar, but it's been interesting for me because now I can very visually see. I'm a visual person. I can see how much time am I spending with my board? How much time am I spending on internal time with my team? How much time am I spending on these external meetings? And I kind of have a different system there. So when I look at my week, I'm like, okay, I've really spent a lot of time with the team this week. Like, what's going on? Is it, am I spending the right time on with the right things? So I haven't figured it all out yet, but it's like those little things are helping you to understand, like, where are you putting your time? Are you putting the right emphasis in the right places? Or are there too many fires you're trying to take out? Like, maybe you need to kind of stand back a little bit. So those are little things that I try to do to help build less chaos, more routine, but it's not balanced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is one of those questions that I as a mentor, that I've had this conversation before, and exactly as you laid out, right? Because there has been over the years, I don't know if the military still does it, but there was this enduring narrative about, we want people to have, a balance, to find balance. And the reality is when you are responding to the needs of the nation, right? And whether it's the fact that, 9/11's happened, and you're in Afghanistan, there's all these operations, and then there's fires at home. Well, there's no such thing as balance, because all of these things need to be serviced, and that's your job. So I try not to discourage people, but also saying, yeah, this whole idea of balance, really think about it. Can you do all of these things the job demands of you, and then do all the things that you would really like to do with your family and friends and hobbies and everything else? You'd need a 60-hour day. So it's just, balance is it's just not realistic.
Well, I think it's also realistic expectations, right? So I think it's a little bit different when you're in defense, because you may have people's lives at stake. In my day-to-day, I gotta think twice before you do something. So if you're doing something off hours, like, is somebody going to be really impacted by this? Is this life-threatening? Like, we all have to have those questions. Some things we think we're more important than we are. But I think that's always a good check and balance. And like, if your answer is, well, yes, I'd love the answer now, but really, is anybody gonna, lose sleep for days on this? And your answer is, well, probably not. You probably don't need to react so quickly. And so that's a tough one for me. Like, I really have to put that control in, that wall in, and be like, okay, step back. And then that allows you, like, the whole balance, like if I'm stressed at work, my family feels it. But for me, like time with my family has always been very, very important. And that's something I really struggle to sacrifice because jobs come and go, but your family's there. So that's kind of always been, something that, and then I think about my, like, people that I work with, and if they're feel like they need to be on all the time, like, I'm probably less important than their family. So really it's all about perspective, right? And it's reminding ourselves that, and sometimes you can get into the zone of being reactive and wanting to do things, and then you got to say, well, is this life-threatening? Yeah, I don't know what your perspective would be in defense. I think that's a little bit of a different space, but
I think there's moments in defense where it absolutely is, but I think those moments are few and far between in the grand scheme of a career. I think it's far more a day-to-day 9 to 5 that most people experience. It's not to say that the profession of arms is the same as everything else. It's absolutely not. And there's some very different aspects to it. But as an example, I mean, I spent 30 years in the military, but I did, just over maybe 2 years deployed on operations internationally. So 2 years out of 30. Most of my day-to-day was like most people's day-to-day. So I wouldn't overplay that hand too much. There's definitely moments where there is no negotiation, and this is just what has to happen. But I think we then project that into the rest of the day-to-day, which then burns people out, like any other business. And I don't think it's required a lot of times. But so in terms of COVE, let's maybe start with how this job came to you, how you came into the role of your CEO, and then maybe we can get into exactly what COVE is and what it does and go from there.
Sure. So COVE itself, how did I get involved with COVE? In my previous role, one of the things that's interesting is when I moved to Nova Scotia, so I was in Ontario before, and I got recruited by this company. And one of the was on the business development side, and one of the projects I was involved in was investments that they were doing in offshore renewable energy. They said, come help us fix this and figure it out. And so I did a couple of projects in the offshore, like offshore wind, offshore tidal energy with this company. And I sort of think about it like, and I remember at the time when I moved to Halifax, and I didn't really have ties at the time in Halifax, and I thought, well, if there's any place in the world that's going to do offshore renewable energy, it's going to be Nova Scotia. Where else are you going to do that in Canada?
Makes sense.
So it kind of made a lot of sense. And that's what got me there. So when I'd kind of worked with that company for several years and thought it was time for me to have change, it was time for, you kind of get sometimes in a career where you're like, I need to pivot and do something different. And I always have a strong entrepreneurial will or drive, whatever you want to call it. And I was kind of ready to build something. And the opportunity with COVE was a couple of things. So I'd been on the board for a brief period, and the founder who started up COVE, he was retiring, and who stood it up. And I was sort of at that pivotal point. It was sort of like, well, this is where I moved to Nova Scotia. It was all about being on the ocean and figuring out, like, seeing it as an advantage, like a Canadian advantage. And that was, like, it just seemed to make sense. It was a good opportunity to test it out. Now, what ended up happening is I took on that role in the prime of COVID, which is
Okay.
not easy to
Oh, that's
take
when
on a
you
leadership.
started.
That's when I started in September 2020. So as everybody knows, in times of leadership during COVID, like, it was just so gray. So decision making and leadership in its best of times is hard. But that was, it was a new organization and just getting its legs underneath itself. COVID was there. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of decisions, a lot of not understanding what was happening and with people and staff and trying to do the right thing, but you never knew if it was the good thing to do. So a lot of uncertainty. And so that was an interesting time. The first year was pretty rocky, I'll say, on a personal level, but it's all growing, it's all learning, and probably stronger for it.
Now, what is COVE? What does it do?
Great. Yeah. So we're focused on commercialization of marine technologies. So any type of technologies that interacts in a marine environment. So it could be above, water and also below, but primarily on surface and below. And it was really established around the crux that in Canada, we have, we are good at developing intellectual property. We have a very, we have very educated people in Canada, and we do a lot of research, but we're not great at commercializing that to drive economic impact, and that's sort of pretty well known. And so a lot of, whether it's talent or the IP goes south or goes elsewhere in the world. And so COVE was to galvanize industry and research community and investments to commercialize a lot of the intellectual property that is being developed in Canada. And so with that being said, we operate a facility in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. So anybody who's listening and not seen us, we're very active on social media, so you can get good footage of what we do on a day-to-day. But we operate a facility there. It's a marine facility. We're industry based. So we've got about 60-ish companies, organizations that are physically on our site, and they develop products, anything from subsea components to hydrophones that listen to underwater sounds that could be like vessels or whatnot, to subsea video, or anyway, so there's quite a broad range of different innovations that are happening in and around COVE. And then on top of our facilities, we've got a marine terminal, so we house different vessels, so large vessels to smaller vessels that do anything from search and rescue, offshore exploration, harbor security, research vessels. So it's quite a wide variety of different types of vessels. And then we have, in the last couple of years, to not only be limited by physical space and location, we've expanded our programming. And amongst that, we work with over 350 businesses, both in Canada and internationally. And that's looking at things like talent development. So talent has always been part of our core programming. And it's really focused on trying to get more skills and a diverse set of skills into the industry, because there's a fairly significant need for talent in the marine sector. We're primarily focused on STEM, I would say, STEM types of profession, but needless to say, we run this amazing internship program that we've been doing for a couple of years, and part of it is to be multidisciplinary, because you can have somebody who's taken a marketing degree and they think, well, marine industry, why would I go into that? That's somebody who's going to be driving a boat. So we bring them in our internship, and all of a sudden they're marketing for like a tech company that's selling products into, X amount of countries. So then they see it as a career. So that's a lot of the work that we do on our talent development side. We also have an innovation team and testing and validation. So that has expanded pretty significantly. So we do some work around, part of the challenges in the marine sector. They're quite complex. And one of the abilities we have is we can bring we have strong networks, and we can bring a lot of companies and organizations together very quickly to help solve a challenge. And I think that's a really neat thing of how we do things. So we've done things like we have a subsea sensor platform, for example. So Canada's done very well in the sensing space and robotics in the marine sector. And so we developed a sensing platform. We built that platform in a time of from design to deployment about 6 months, which that's a short turnaround, and deployed it in the ocean. It's cable connected, and we did that with about 30 different companies to get that product in the water. And so that's the type of stuff that we can facilitate very quick, nimble innovation. And so our innovation testing team is focused on enabling infrastructure, both offshore and onshore, to help companies advance their technologies.
Okay.
This would be, in some put more simply. And then the other area that I'd say is a big growth area has been around, we have a startup incubator on our site. So helping more startups, the ideation. We like to be further along because we're very close to the customer. And so the companies that are, pre-revenue potentially, but have a good potential for revenue.
Right.
Like that's more our sweet spot. And then a lot of our clientele is SMEs. So we launched a scale-up accelerator with the UK that's been very successful. We're in our second year of it. And that's for companies that aren't in the startup. Like they've got a product, they're evolving their product line, but they're at a standstill. And they're at steady state. And so how do they kind of go up that next step? And so that's what our Scale Up Accelerator is about. And we're working with other markets on launching others of those. And then more recently, we were announced as an accelerator of NATO's program called Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, so DIANA, known as DIANA. And that's about advancing technologies that have dual use applications. So they work in the defense space, and they also have an application in a commercial context, which is actually really good for the business because then it gives them, two paths to build their business. And we're still in the early days of that, but that accelerator and our work in that accelerator will be hopefully starting in the coming months.
I want to sort of touch on a couple of things that you mentioned to get your thoughts on. So I guess the first thing is about IP and sort of describing for the listener who might not understand what IP is and why it's important, and maybe a little bit on how critical it is to protect IP would be something that I'm interested in. And then after that, maybe we'll dive into innovation a little bit, because again, I think it's a word that's thrown around a lot, but I think it merits a little bit more sort of discussion on why being innovative is really important in a lot of ways for Canadians. So maybe we'll just start with intellectual property.
Sure, yeah. So for a business, intellectual property can be developed. It could be developed through academic research. It could be developed through a business or in other ways. But intellectual property, it's generally your idea. Like it's an idea that is very hard to recreate. And that's part of your, in a business context, it's part of how it differentiates you from others in the market. So from a business point of view, holding on to intellectual property and protecting that. So one, you've got to validate it, but once you've validated it and there's no one else that has that IP in the market, like you've got to hold on to that, because that's part of how you're going to how you're going to differentiate yourself how you're going to differentiate your business, but also presumably if you've got intellectual property that has value to the customer, it's also how you're going to be able to sell something that's of value to the customer. And so IP, and I'm not an IP expert by any means, but there's certain years that you can hold on to IP. You can protect it in different countries. So when you work with, depending on the type of IP, like in oceans, there's certain markets that are more or have a higher concentration of intellectual property, and for example in the marine tech space.
Okay.
So that's where you really want to protect, because those kind of markets where you want to protect, because you don't want them to steal your idea. So it's really about trying to protect your idea and the product that you're either about to develop, because sometimes IP can be not about a physical thing, it can be about an idea. So you're really trying to protect that so nobody steals that. And that's what really helps build your business. So when I'm working with businesses and I advise, a company, and I always say, like, so do you have a license for your IP? Because sometimes IP gets developed when people start a business and they did their master's or they did their PhD in a university.
Right.
Well, oftentimes that IP can be owned by the university. It's not actually owned by the person who's done the work on it. And then all of a sudden they leave there and they say, well, I've got a really interesting thing. There's a market for it. I can make money on this. I developed it. And then they realize they don't have a rights to that idea. And they've got to figure out how to negotiate with the university, how to get that license to them. There's different forms of it, but a lot of people don't realize that. And, you can't steal somebody else's idea.
Right.
Like, that's what intellectual property is. So in shorter and simple terms, that's sort of the concept of intellectual IP and how valuable it is.
Yeah. There's definitely lots of discussion today about the importance of protecting IP, because I think for me, I look at it as the sort of pot of gold at the end of the intellectual rainbow. We have so many creative people here in Canada that we need to be able to protect that intellectual property of all the great work that the Canadians do, whether it comes out of academia, out of industry, whatever it is. It's so important.
Well, I think the other part to that is we need to protect it, but we also need to nurture it. And so one of the things that happens a lot in Canada, and again, I go back to why was COVE formed around commercialization, so we can develop IP, but oftentimes that IP may be invested in by somebody outside of Canada. So then you go where your investors are, it leaves the country, or it's developed by talent who gets, job offers somewhere else because they developed some IP. So I think that's something that, that's why, our area on our accelerators and all that is about nurturing that a lot more, getting access to capital, getting, different ways to help nurture that IP. It's not just about protecting it, it's about keeping it in Canada.
Yeah.
So it's just not bought elsewhere and developed elsewhere, because that's when you lose a lot of the value of it. So if we just had, a database of intellectual property in Canada, it's not going to do much if it sits in a database. It's what do you actually do with it? And that's kind of the important piece. And that is, it's hard. Like, it's hard to nurture that and keep it in Canada.
Is there any sort of best practices for nurturing IP to encourage the owners of that IP to stay in Canada as opposed to going to a place like the U.S. that might have deeper pockets or has a different system that allows it to be nurtured and scaled and commercialized?
Well, there's a lot of ways. So one is, when a company is looking to build their product line based on the IP that they have, they're looking at where are the markets that are going to use that IP. And so one of the things, I've been in Ottawa, as I've been talking about procurement, but one of the areas is, Canada can procure innovative products. And that's the procurement process in Canada is a challenge. So if we were buying our own products, that would be a good way to keep it within country, or at least some of it at least. So, automatically businesses are not going to markets all around the world to try to sell their product. They could actually stay home and sell their products. So that's one way. I think the other thing that, we've got to, a business goes where they get invested in. So I think we've got to attract more capital, private investment into these new innovations. And we've got to get, Canadians to understand the importance of these new innovations. And instead of buying from other countries, like, why aren't we buying from Canada or Canadians or Canadian innovative companies. So I don't think the answer is very simple. Like, it's not a straight answer, but there's a lot of other things we could be doing. And I mean, COVE's just one entity. We're trying to do our best in an area in the marine tech space. Sometimes I get asked, well, could you look at space? Could you look at other areas? And I'm like, I already feel like the maritime domain is pretty big, and when we look at all the innovation that's happening there, I'm like, well, there's a lot we need to tackle there. So why don't we, bite the bullet in one area and try to take some steps to improve, have some focus, and try to make improvements and try to make impact. So yeah, I mean, that question could expand in multiple different ways, but that's sort of our focus at COVE, is trying to make impact in this focused area. And it kind of makes sense because, Canada does have the longest coastlines in the world. We've got the Arctic we need to protect. We have coastal communities. We have, we live in Atlantic Canada. We have fishers. We have now the talk of offshore wind energy and we need different types of energy in Atlantic Canada. So there's a lot of reason why it makes sense to try to develop this innovation and keep it so that we actually use it and we don't end up, buying from somebody else in the world, when we do have a lot of, as we say, like talented people, smart people. We've got innovative companies, but, we need to kind of believe that, there's a need to keep it here and try to work together to figure out how to do that.
So what's the importance of innovation? Why is this something that, again, we should nurture, or maybe set an environment that encourages people to be innovative and bring their ideas forward? Why does that matter for a country?
That's also a very big question. But one of the things, I was talking to somebody, he's not a mentor yet, but maybe he'll be a mentor, talking about mentor. But I agreed with him. I think if you're not innovating, it's very hard to stay competitive. And you're not innovating in policies. It's not just about, businesses, but I think it's all around. If you're not innovating, people are changing. Society is changing. We have different global circumstances. We're not, you can't work in isolation anymore. So if you're not innovating, you can get stuck behind. And I would tend to think that, I know from a business perspective, like being stuck behind is never a good place. So I've got to think as a nation, if we're not innovating, or we're not looking at society as a whole and ways to improve society, whether it's in medicine, or it's in climate change, or it's in sovereign capabilities or security, then we're very dependent on others. And that's probably not a great place to be.
So when you say innovating or innovation, in your mind, is that building something completely new? Is that taking something that exists and making it materially better? What's that sort of spectrum of innovation look like in your mind?
I mean, it could look like, innovation, as you say, is such a broad word, but the way that, innovation, when I talk to my team, is that we've got to be innovative. And sometimes people think they go to technology. They think, right, well, it's got to be about technology. What is she talking about? She's, you got to be innovative. I'm not a person but it's about how you look at things. And it's, it could be a process, and the process is really cumbersome. And it's like, why do you just keep doing it forever? And it's cumbersome, and people get pissed off or whatever, like they're just challenged by the process, and you just kind of complain about it. But if we were innovative, we'd probably say, well, what if we did this different? And are you willing to try it? And you might do it well, you might not, you might learn for it, and maybe it's not the right approach, but at least you're open to trying. And I think that's what's innovation for me, is like the openness to not necessarily just continue with the status quo. And so sometimes it's about, yes, it's about a technology, but it can be about just doing something differently, because it could improve productivity, it could improve efficiency, it could improve our health. There's so many ways that innovation comes about. So I think for me, it's a lot more about a mentality, or almost a culture of innovation, versus a thing. And sometimes we think about it as a thing, but I like to talk about it as a culture of innovation. And whether it's marketing or otherwise your competitors, like now everything's available on the internet.
Right.
I mean, it's very easy to, if you're not being innovative, it's very easy to copy and paste these days. So that's what generally can keep you ahead, is if you're innovative. And you could be innovative in your marketing, or you could be innovative in your products, or you could be innovative in your people. You just have something that's, your people are just very innovative, that allows your organization or your business to just be ahead of the game. And so it kind of keeps you that, that competitive edge.
Melanie, thanks for taking the time to be on the podcast today. This is fantastic, and I really appreciate you being one of our Northern Sentinels.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Chris. It was great to be here.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Melanie Nadeau. Please take a minute to subscribe to The Greater Good on Substack and get this and other content to help you citizen better. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.